Order, order. Good morning and welcome. Before we begin, can I encourage members to wear masks when they're not speaking? This is in line with the current government guidance and how the House of Commons Commission is prescribed. Please also, would you give each other, members of staff, space when seated and when entering and leaving the room. And members should send their speaking notes by email to hansardnotes@parliament.uk. Similarly, officials should communicate electronically with ministers. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to invite Sarah Champion to move the motion.
Good morning, Mr Davies. As ever, it's a pleasure to share under your chairmanship and also to see so many members here, which I think shows the significance of not just the debate, but what's happening in Ethiopia at the moment. I beg to move that this House has considered the humanitarian situation in Tigray. The situation there is truly horrific. This could be a debate about conflict prevention or regional stability or foreign policy in the Horn of Africa. But it is the dreadful humanitarian situation and the terrible conditions of the people in Tigray are having to endure that must be our focus today. It was that dire situation that motivated my committee to produce a short report. I'm grateful to the government for their response to that, and I look forward to hearing more from the Minister shortly. Let us be clear, it is conflict that has driven a worsening humanitarian situation in Tigray. Against a backdrop of deteriorating political relationships between the regional government in Tigray and the federal government in Addis Ababa, the Ethiopian National Defence Force started security operations in Tigray in November 2020. The Tigray Regional Security Forces have fought against them, retaking the Tigrayan capital of Meleke in June. Local militia and unidentified troops are involved. Eritrean troops are fighting in Tigray and are alleged to have committed human rights violations and abuses. I don't want to dwell too long on the causes and the nature of the conflict, save to note two things. It is clear that there have been abuses by all parties to the conflict, and all parties are using propaganda and misinformation to advance their cause. And all the time, it is the people that suffer. Peoples whose lives were already difficult, whose livelihoods were under threat from climate change and the worst desert lotus infestation for decades. People who were already hosting populations displaced by previous conflicts in the region. I would like to set out briefly some of the key humanitarian challenges before going on to talk about some of the grave violations of human rights that have been reported. I want to focus on women and girls because, like in so many other conflicts and crises around the world, it is the women and girls who are disproportionately impacted once again. We must find a way to end the heartbreaking and unimaginable horrors that some women and girls have had to endure and continue to face in a form of gender-based violence and sexual violence. The first issue that arises in conflict is the risk of injury or death. People fearing for their lives and those of their family flee areas of conflict. An estimated of 2.1 million people have been displaced due to the conflict. In Tigray, many people have fled rural areas and thousands of displaced people are being hosted within communities in large urban areas. These communities are themselves already stressed by the effects of conflict and shortages of food, water and access to essential services. People aren't always safe once they have fled. The unpredictable nature of conflict means fighting often erupts unexpectedly. People have to flee fighting more than once. The effect on their lives and livelihoods is devastating, sowing the seeds of problems that will endure for years. Access is another major problem. Humanitarian agencies have been prevented by the conflict from reaching people in need. They have been unable to access areas to deliver vital supplies, while the lack of access also makes it much more difficult to assess need. The latest UN OCHA situation report says that no trucks will have entered Tigray since the 20th of August. Since 15th of July, only 321 trucks with humanitarian supplies have entered the region, providing only a fraction of the assistance needed by the 5.2 million people in need. The reality is 100 trucks a day are required to meet the demand. It's true that there have been some improvements in access, and at about the time we were preparing our report, it looked like agreements had been secured. However, it's not yet good enough to meet the needs of the people affected by the fighting. Parts of Tigray remain problematic to this day, with fighting still disrupting across routes and belligerents on all sides failing to recognise permissions granted to humanitarian agencies. Can I take this moment to pay tribute to the extraordinary work these humanitarian agencies are doing in the face of terrible difficulties and huge personal risks. Tragically, some humanitarian workers have been killed. Worst, it seems they have been deliberately murdered. Thousands of people in Tigray have not had access they need to food and water. Over 400,000 people are suffering catastrophic levels of hunger, and more than 4 million, around 70% of the population, are experiencing high levels of food insecurity. Combatants have blocked food aid from reaching its destination. It's been looted by soldiers, and there are reports of food silos being contaminated. Beyond these immediate life-sustaining needs, the conflict has brought about a collapse of essential services. Communication was cut off in the early part of the conflict. There have been power shortages, markets have closed, the internet's down, making bank transfers extremely difficult, banking has been disrupted, and essential services have collapsed. But to talk simply of the collapse of essential services would be to hide the shocking and awful truth that schools, hospitals, the means of production have all been deliberately and systematically targeted, vandalised and destroyed. Where schools haven't been vandalised, they're being occupied, either by the combatants or by displaced people seeking some kind of refuge. With markets closed and limited access for food deliveries, adequate nutrition is a real problem. An estimated 45,000 children under 5 are suffering from malnutrition, while health centres are reportedly running out of stock. But it gets worse because farmers, where the farms and machinery haven't been vandalised, are unable to plant crops. Only 25 to 50% of cereal production will be available this year. Soldiers are reported to have beaten people they've seen ploughing fields. Harvests have been destroyed and livestock looted. All of this in a part of the world that was already severely stressed by changes in climate and the effects of desert locusts. There is a real prospect of famine and the creation of yet another cycle of aid dependency in a part of the world that has suffered so much in the past and that has hoped to leave this sort of problem behind it. And then we turn to the atrocities, the mass killings and the chilling sexual violence. We know that there have been massacres. The clifftop killing of 25 to 35 civilians near Mahabi Diego, the killing of 160 people in Bora village in southern Tigray, the massacre of 100 people in Aksum in November by Eritrean soldiers. We know that there have been extrajudicial killings. In March, MSF staff witnessed young men being pulled off buses and killed. We know that women and girls have been raped. In February, a young mother was abducted and over 11 days repeatedly raped by 23 soldiers who, at the end of her ordeal, forced a rock and nails into her vagina. 12 women, 5 of whom were pregnant, were raped in front of family members, including their children. We know that some women have been held captive and repeatedly raped by soldiers and militia. Mark Lowcock, the UN Under-Secretary-General for Humanitarian Affairs, acknowledged this after the Reuters investigation found women and girls as young as 8 being targeted. It's brutal, dehumanising treatment. That the perpetrators caused these terrible acts to be witnessed by family members suggested they intended the effect to be terrorising. And I think that clearly points to the use of rape and sexual violence being used as a weapon of war. Since February, 1,228 cases of sexual and gender-based violence have been reported. Yet we know that for every rape, sexual violence case that's reported, there are many, many more that aren't. The UN Population Fund estimates that there might be 22,500 survivors of sexual violence who will seek clinical care this year. Let me note at this point that the UK government has slashed funding to the UNFPA by an astonishing 85%. I dread to think of the impact this will have on the women and girls in humanitarian crises like that of Tigray. We know a lot about what the survivors of atrocity and sexual violence actually need to recover. Sadly, we also know that, with much of the healthcare system in Tigray in tatters, there is little prospect of the survivors getting the support that they need. The stories emerging via these organisations are horrifying. Many of the survivors will go on to suffer long-term, debilitating physical and mental trauma. It may well be years before the health system are recovered to the point where women and girls will be able to get the support they need. It's important that the world bears witness to what is happening in Tigray. And the international system must do all that it can to bring the perpetrators to justice. I commend the work being done by the UN and by the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission to investigate. And can I ask the Minister to try and allow access to the African Commission of Human and People Rights? At the moment, they're stuffing difficulties trying to get in and carry out their investigation. It's vital that evidence of human rights violations and abuses alleged, committed by all parties in Tigray, is secured and investigated properly. It's important for the victims this happens. It's important as a warning to others. In our report, we said the situation in Tigray was an early test of the UK's commitment to the principles and approach of the UK as a force for good set out in the government's integrated review. It still is. We recognise the Tigray crisis as a test of the FCDO's desire to combine diplomacy and development and to establish an integrated approach to conflict and instability. We pointed out that failing this early test could damage the credibility of the UK's new strategy. My committee welcomes the government's response and the government's acceptance of the key points we made about ending conflict and preventing it from spreading, ensuring that humanitarian needs are met, finding a sustainable political solution, and supporting a process for reconciliation. I welcome the work of Nick Dyer, the UK Special Envoy for Famine Prevention and Humanitarian Affairs, and I welcome too the support the government has provided to the humanitarian agencies working in Tigray. But let's be clear, the biggest challenge in the UK development policy has been to the cuts to ODA on a basis that, as they've been put, we will likely to see them remain for the remainder of this Parliament, and very much longer. The tests that the government has set for the return to 0.7 are potentially impossibly hard to meet. The government's response claims that Her Majesty's government has been at the forefront of the international response throughout the conflict. UN OCHA reckons the current gap in funding for the situation in Tigray is $170 million. There is a very real risk that the government's wholly unnecessary cuts to ODA will undermine our response. So I have several questions that I hope the Minister will be able to address in his remarks. I will, of course, give way.
Giving way and pay tribute to her for securing this debate and for the comprehensive way in which she's described both the scale and the brutality of the conflict. But one issue which she hasn't referred to is the potential use of chemical weapons by the Ethiopian forces, and on which I tabled a written question to the Minister in June. And I understand the government was seeking to verify from the Minister's response the truth of these allegations. But is she also concerned about those reports and thinks that, and would she agree that that should be part of the issues that the government is seeking to address?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and he's absolutely right. I think the problem that we have is that verification. I mean, I saw the pictures of the chemical attack. I have no doubt from seeing those pictures that that's what happened. But unless we are able to get people on the ground to capture that data and to verify it, it's incredibly difficult for us to be able to encourage the government, encourage the international community to actually take a more robust response to this. And that's why I think it's so important that we as parliamentarians keep on raising this, both the access to gather the data, to get the evidence so that then people can be held to account, but also just keeping it on our government's agenda. So, my questions to the Minister. I've numbered them. 1. How will the cuts in UK's ODA affect Ethiopia, and in particular the humanitarian situation in Tigray? And what does, I quote, being at the forefront of the international response mean for the UK's response to the current shortfall in funding? 2. What steps will the government be taking to put pressure on belligerents to end the fighting? And will he also press the UN to act on the issue of rape and hunger being used as weapons of war? 3. Will he update the House on the deployment of the PSVI experts in Tigray? And what assessment has the government made of the impact of aid cuts to programmes such as the UNFPA in supporting survivors of sexual violence in the long term? 4. What steps has he taken since the government's response was issued in July to prioritise Tigray? And what recent discussions has he had with aid agencies, the UN and other actors in the region? 5. Has the delivery of aid improved significantly since the government published its response to our report? And what are the next steps in the delivery of aid if it is to be further improved? 6. What steps is he taking to put pressure on the Ethiopian government and regional authorities to improve access and communications? 7, how concerned is he about the safety of humanitarian workers in Tigray and what can be done to better protect them? And Minister, finally, 8, what is his latest assessment of the conflict spreading in Ethiopia and what impacts fighting on Amara and Amoro and other parts of Ethiopia is having on the work of the UK government in Tigray? Will people displaced by those conflicts depend on the same pot of money as the people in Tigray? The last month has been dramatic and traumatic in equal measure. But with attention focused in Afghanistan, it is easy for a crisis in Tigray to slip from our collective consciousness. Even without Afghanistan, Haiti may have pushed Tigray off the news cycle, and we hear precious little day to day about what is happening in Ethiopia. The reports are there if you look for them, but as a very real crisis, it does not get the level of attention it should. It's clear the violence in Ethiopia has spread, and the risks we identified of conflict spreading further are still very real. In closing, let me just say this. We must not lose sight of the situation in Tigray. The level of human suffering and the risk of conflict spreading demand it. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Sir Champion, Chair of the International Development Committee. We've got 9 speakers, and on my mathematics, that's about 4.5 minutes. So can I invite Andrew Mitchell, first of all? Andrew.
Thank you very much, Mr. Davis. It's a pleasure to serve under your benign sway today. And may I congratulate the Chairman of the Development Select Committee on so ably leading this debate and all the work that she and her committee do, and also to join her in praising hugely the humanitarian actors who are in harm's way in Tigray today. Mr. Davis, I went with Bob Geldof, who probably knows more about the situation in this part of Africa than most people in Britain, to see the Foreign Secretary some months ago at the start of this crisis. And I have to say I was extremely impressed that the Foreign Office and the Foreign Secretary were absolutely on top of what was happening. And I want to say today that with so much else going on, there is a danger that the public attention on what is happening in Tigray, so eloquently described by the Honourable Lady, is missing. There isn't enough public attention, and I urge the media to ensure that that attention increases very greatly. There is a lot else going on. Because the situation, Mr. Davis, is this. There's a massive deterioration in the position on the ground. 7 million people at least need urgent assistance. The position is set out yesterday on the BBC website. 150 people were found by the BBC to have starved to death. And this really matters to us in Britain. The development programme in Ethiopia in 2011 was the biggest development programme anywhere in the world. This is a big country, and there have been huge development gains there on the ground in terms of health, in terms of education, particularly among girls, and in terms of the rights of women as well. Enormous progress in that respect. And Britain has huge strategic interests there, both commercial and security interests. Ethiopia, for example, is pulling troops out of Somalia at the moment. That creates space for al-Shabaab to do their evil work there. There are huge flows of desperate people across the border into Sudan. Sudan is a fragile country. Millions of people are displaced. The whole thing destabilizes the region. And Ethiopia, by this conflict, is being pulled apart. Liberation movements are growing in strength, alliances. At the best of times, Ethiopia is a very fragile democracy, and it is a country of 110 million people, and a major collapse there of itself will have far more impact than Syria or Libya or Yemen, and we need to bear that in mind. So what, Mr. Davis, should we be seeking? First of all, we need to seek a cessation of fighting on all sides. And secondly, we need humanitarian access, which is grossly inadequate at the moment. And it needs to be led by the international community, drawing on British expertise, and by the United Nations, and by the World Food Programme, which is doing an enormous amount of good work there at the moment. But their funding has been cut from 21 million last year to 9 million this year, and that needs to be put right. We need to recognise that people are starving to death in Tigray, that there is massive violence as set out by the Honourable Lady, so I won't repeat that. But Britain has a big strategic interest. Whether you care about development or not, Britain has a huge strategic interest in this part of the world, and in particular in Ethiopia, where millions and millions of pounds of taxpayers' money have been spent on the ground to massive effect, to real effect. And that is why this debate matters so much, and that is why the issues that we are discussing are so important today.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your brevity as well. Can I now invite Navendra Mishra, a member of the International Development Committee, to give his contribution. Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairship. I'd like to start by paying tribute to the honourable member for Rotherham, who's also my colleague on the International Development Committee, for securing this debate at a critical juncture for millions of Tigrayans. I'd also like to reference Oxfam, Amnesty International and Protection Approaches for the briefing they provided on this issue. As we have heard today, the escalating tensions in Tigray are deeply concerning, and the international community must act urgently to put pressure on the governments of Eritrea and Ethiopia and the Tigrayan authorities to bring an end to this latest conflict, which has now lasted almost a year and cost thousands of lives. The UK government must do all it can to de-escalate the rising tensions, investigate the reported war crimes, and put pressure on all sides to allow non-governmental organisations to access the thousands of Tigrayans who are the victims of this conflict. Their lives remain at risk, and they will continue to suffer unless urgent action is taken to prevent vital aid to enter the region. Mr. Davies, more than 400,000 people in Tigray are experiencing famine-like conditions. To put that into context, that is more than the rest of the world combined. Furthermore, the Red Cross has estimated that almost 6 million people in Tigray and the neighbouring regions of Afar and Amara are also going hungry, while an additional 1.7 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance as a result of a recent conflict. It is clear that we are witnessing a humanitarian crisis unfold before our eyes in Tigray. I'm a proud member of the International Development Committee, and earlier this year we urged the UK government to intervene in this crisis to bring a swift end to the conflict and help facilitate humanitarian access. Since then, there has been a deterioration in the situation, while the ability of NGOs and aid organisations to access the region has diminished. For example, Oxfam told members of this House that aid organisations are struggling to transport the 100 trucks a day of food supplies that are required into the region. It is therefore vital that the UK government applies pressure to ensure there is unfettered and unimpeded access to Tigray to enable this life-saving aid to be delivered to thousands of people. Given our historic relationship with the region, we should do all we can to help. Amnesty International has raised concerns that attacks and mass killings have continued unchecked since the conflict started last November, with crimes against humanity taking place on both sides between the Ethiopian and Eritrean governments and Tigrayan rebels. Worryingly, a report this week by the Daily Telegraph newspaper revealed that since July, soldiers occupying parts of Ethiopia's Tigray region have been involved in what has been described as an ethnic purge of native people who are being thrown into concentration camps and massacred by the dozen. Witnesses in the northern city of Humera, near the border with Eritrea, have claimed that soldiers from Amara province have been conducting Taliban-type door-to-door searches for ethnic Tigrayan people, the result of which being that thousands of residents have been forced into makeshift detention centres. Such scenes followed reports, which have since been corroborated by the UN, of Eritrean troops systematically killing hundreds of unarmed civilians in the northern city of Axum over a 2-day period last November, which saw open shooting in the streets. Amnesty has said that this could amount to crime against humanity and has also described it as just a tip of the iceberg given the mass killings that followed. The charity has also heard shocking reports of gang rapes of people held in captivity, which they've described as sexual slavery, as well as clear examples of sexual mutilation of survivors, of which which is a crime under international law. The toll on all citizens in the region has been unbearable. Since the beginning of the conflict, there have been widespread and systematic campaigns of destruction and looting, including the theft of farm animals, which has significantly affected harvesting across Tigray, compounding the famine and starvation of the population. What is clear, Mr. Davis, is that the UK government cannot delay action any further. We must not lose sight of this crisis and the fate of thousands of Tigrayans while the eyes of the world are on Afghanistan, which we must continue to add pressure to allow organisations such as the African Commission on Human and People's Rights to have access to Tigray to investigate the situation further and carry out a thorough assessment of the impact of this conflict. The charity protection approaches, which work to tackle all forms of identity-based violence and mass atrocities, has rightly stated that the UK government has a legal obligation to prevent further conflict in the region under the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. but is also a matter for national interest, and left unchecked, the financial and human cost will be enormous. Much of this would be in keeping with what Tigrayans have already called for, which is a commitment to a negotiated end to this war, and the UK should help facilitate that. Failure to support them in this endeavour would lead to an ongoing conflict that will cost tens of thousands of more lives. Thank you for allowing me to speak.
Thank you so much. Now, can I invite Fiona Bruce to speak on this issue she's familiar with?
Thank you, Mr Davis. I declare my interest speaking as co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Eritrea, and thank the Honourable Member for Rotherham for not only securing the debate today and for her graphic speech, but also for chairing the pre-briefing which the APPG and Eritrea co-hosted yesterday. We must do all that we can to fulfil our international obligations to prevent mass atrocities of the nature occurring in Tigray. Christian Solidarity Worldwide report on worrying indications that atrocity crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity and possibly genocide may have occurred and could well still be underway in Tigray. In the words of a priest from the Catholic eparchy of Idakrat, interviewed at the height of the occupation, they want to annihilate Tigray. By killing men and boys, they are trying to destroy any future resistance. They are raping and destroying women to ensure they cannot raise a community in the future. They are using rape and food as weapons of war. By June 2021, researchers at Belgium's University of Ghent had documented 10,000 deaths and 230 massacres, with many more incidents yet to be fully investigated. No one, anywhere, should be targeted on account of their religion or beliefs, yet in Tigray, clergy and worshippers have been targeted and killed in large numbers. According to a statement in February from the employees of Mekelle Diocese and the administrators of 45 monasteries and churches, almost every monastery and church and religious school in Tigray has been bombed by drones or heavy weapons, and a lot of clergymen, deacons, congregation members of Sunday schools, religious students and children, especially those clergymen who were on religious service, were massacred like animals. The indiscriminate bombing and destruction of ancient churches, mosques and other religious institutions, the extensive looting of irreplaceable historical artefacts and manuscripts appear to be part of a multifaceted campaign that involves cultural cleansing. Not only do these actions violate international humanitarian law, but according to the Rome Statute, intentionally directing attacks against religious buildings and historic monuments can also constitute a war crime. In 2019, our government published a good policy paper, the UK approach to preventing mass atrocities. In places like Tigray now, we need to see actions to match with the strong words from that document. Words such as, the UK supports the deployment of all appropriate tools available to the UN in dealing with potential atrocities and conflict, such as sanctions, diplomatic travel bans, asset freezes, arms embargoes and commodity interdiction, and is a strong advocate for securing accountability and justice for atrocities committed. And developing programmatic support aims to foster environments where atrocities are far less likely to take place by addressing the root causes of conflict and drivers of instability through tackling corruption, promoting good governance, involving access to security and justice and inclusive economic development. And I hope in his closing remarks that the Minister will elaborate on how these words are being applied now to the UK's approach towards the conflict in Tigray and towards the wider region, not least to help de-escalate tensions. I also note the recommendations of the International Development Select Committee for Atrocity Prevention Training. In addition, the Truro Review, a manifesto commitment of this government, at Recommendation 7 states, to ensure that there are mechanisms in place to facilitate an immediate response to atrocity crimes, including genocide through activities such as setting up early warning mechanisms to identify countries at risk of atrocities, diplomacy to help de-escalate tensions and resolve disputes, and developing support to help with upstream prevention work. Recognising that the ultimate determination of genocide must be legal, not political, and respecting the UK's long-held policy in this area, the FCDO should nonetheless determine its policy in accordance with the legal framework and should be willing to make public statements condemning such atrocities. Colleagues can be assured that as the Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Freedom of Religion or Belief, I am working closely, indeed daily, with FCDO to ensure that we implement this and indeed all 22 recommendations of the Truro review in full by their required completion date of July 2022.
Thank you very much. Can I now invite Patrick Grady to make his contribution? Patrick.
Pleasure to serve, and I join the congratulations to the chair of the International Development Committee in securing the debate. It's so important to keep this issue on the table in the face of so many other global challenges taking place today. And it is so concerning and disappointing and worrying to hear the kind of stories and testimony that we already have today, because several years ago Ethiopia was looking like a bit of a success story. It was quite a stable country. There were increasing food security, and Prime Minister Abiy was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. But unfortunately, it's not the first time in recent years that the Nobel Committee seems to have jumped ahead of itself slightly and given awards that maybe, in hindsight, it should have taken a bit more time to think about. I also want to echo the thanks of others to those who supported the briefing yesterday, which was incredibly helpful and I think has informed a lot of what we've heard today. And we've heard the statistics again, OCHA estimating 2 million people internally displaced, 61% facing acute food insecurity, 600,000 already over the threshold into famine, and another 2 million on the brink, what the Oxfam rep who spoke to us yesterday described as the risk of catastrophic hunger. And as we've heard, multiple complex overlapping causes which require multiple overlapping interventions. The huge displacement, the lack of infrastructure, the destruction of roads and bridges that simply make getting aid to where it's needed almost impossible. The communications blackout has come up time and time again in the briefings and the evidence. A military tactic, but completely undermining humanitarian relief, which should be able to be delivered over and above whatever's going on in terms of conflict. And this dreadful use of hunger as a weapon of war. And we've heard the stories again about the deliberate destruction of crops and livestock. And there are particular concerns around ethnic tensions and tribal loyalties which have fuelled the conflict and political division. The member for Sutton Coldfield spoke about the serious risk of regional overspill, the influence of Eritrea, the displacement over 60,000 refugees into Sudan already. And within the country as well, I do want to touch briefly, particularly on the situation in Oromia. I have a very active constituent originally from Oromia, part of the Oromia support group, and that has identified extrajudicial killings going back to October 2018, and of over 2,000 of them, 1,612 were identified as being from the Oromo group. But the support group is calling for, and its colleagues is calling for, an inclusive dialogue between all these factions with a view to ending any domination of one group over another. And I would encourage the Minister, I'll send them the information that I have, and I would encourage him to look at that very carefully indeed. Because there is a challenge here for the government. How is it going to live up to the standards that it has set for itself in being proactive about atrocity prevention? How is it going to use its convening power, its diplomatic influence? If it wants to be this soft power superpower, will it start by properly supporting agencies on the ground, multilateral, the United Nations, some of the NGOs that in very difficult circumstances, such as Save the Children, are maintaining a direct presence? And what is the impact of the aid cuts going to be? Time and again in Westminster Hall now, we're hearing practical, real-life examples of this completely unnecessary cut, and it's having an impact, both practical terms in terms of what can actually be delivered, and it's having a diplomatic effect as well, because it undermines the UK's stance on the world stage. So there is a need to work with all the agencies, all the partners, and recognise the government's obligations under international law. One of the most sobering questions that was posed yesterday was, what if this isn't the worst? What if the worst is yet to come? And too often we've stood by when we should have learned the lessons of the past. So the UK has to assess, it has to intervene, it has to work with others and make sure that we avoid even further and more rapid deterioration.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Lawrence Robertson. Lawrence.
Thank you, Mr Davis. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today. As the chairman of the all-party parliamentary group on Ethiopia and somebody who's visited the country many times, can I congratulate the honourable member for Rotherham on securing this debate and for the very moving way in which she spoke and described the terrible situation in Tigray. And can I thank her for her continued interest and her committee's interest in Ethiopia. And also can I thank the Minister for his willingness to provide briefings and attend meetings regularly on this subject and his ongoing involvement. I held an urgent question on the 14th of June, and sadly the situation, if anything, has deteriorated since then. But it needn't be this way, as has been alluded to. Ethiopia is a great country. It claims to have been the origin of coffee, to have Lucy, one of the world's oldest human beings, found 4.4 million years ago. It's been independent longer than any African country. I'm not quite sure of the claims about the Queen of Sheba, but I do know that Ethiopia is one of the West's oldest Christian civilizations. And that is one of the tragedies, that Christian and Muslim populations, sizable as they are in Ethiopia, have lived very peacefully together. Over 80 tribes and probably as many languages have managed to coexist very peacefully since the overthrow of the Derg in 1992. Ethiopia has also enjoyed, I'm told, world record growth in the last 15 years. Certainly, it's one of Africa's outstanding success stories in that sense. And it really is ironic that trouble has flared since the appointment of the outward-looking, modernising Prime Minister, who, as has also been said, won the Nobel Peace Prize for making peace with Eritrea after a very long-standing dispute. But it is right also to say that the rumblings of discontent started actually before he took office and sadly have increased since. We also know that Ethiopia has suffered recently because of the unusually warm weather, the attack of locusts, and also, of course, COVID has not helped. And it's also right to recognise that a number of people, millions of people in Ethiopia each year do depend on food aid. But I'm really rather struck by what the World Food Programme people have said this week, that up to 7 million people are in dire need of food assistance in northern Ethiopia alone, that their food stocks in Tigray are running perilously low, and that they need $140 million to expand its northern Ethiopian response. That is what they have said just this week. I won't go into the details of the conflict, which has been so ably covered by the honourable member for Rotherham, but I will ask just a few questions. As far as the Minister knows, has the conflict spread as far as Lalibela, a town I visited on my last visit to Ethiopia, and it really would be tragic if it had got that far. Could the United Nations actually be doing more beyond helping refugees, which is a very important thing for them to be doing, but could they actually be doing more? Could the African Union be doing more, especially in speaking to the TPLF and also to Eritrea to make sure that their troops are actually all withdrawn from the country? During the UQ, the Minister talked about how he'd diverted aid to Tigray. Did that have any effect? And if so, could that practice be repeated? And I would also ask that other donors do not turn away from Ethiopia because of the conflict, because people living in war-torn areas are often the ones who are most in need. So I do want us to continue with our aid programme. We need to target the aid. We need to require transparency. We should use it as a lever, if possible, to bring about peace, but we should continue it. And I close by saying that as a very long-standing friend of Ethiopia, as somebody who has stood in this chamber and the main chamber and defended Ethiopia when perhaps it's been questionable that I should have done so, but I have defended Ethiopia as a friend, and I would just call on all the parties there to resolve this conflict very quickly and very peacefully. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your words. I'll be calling front benches at 10:28, and we're keeping good time. So without further ado, over to you, Helen Hayes. Look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Mr Davies. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I also congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Rotherham, on securing this very important debate today. November will mark 1 year since the onset of violence in the Tigray region of Ethiopia, which started in retaliation to an attack on the Northern Command by the Tigray People's Liberation Front. This is a complex conflict with many different actors on the ground. But the reports of this conflict have consistently included evidence of mass executions, the targeting of Tigrayans by ethnicity, the destruction of crops, livestock and machinery, and the use of rape and sexual violence as a weapon of war. It is estimated that tens of thousands of Tigrayan women and girls have been raped since this conflict began. The conflict has led to a humanitarian disaster in Tigray, with NGOs continuing to report difficulties getting into the region. The latest reports indicate that Tigray is still facing siege-like conditions, and a recent UN aid convoy was held for 2 days at a checkpoint, after which only 9 of the trucks were allowed to proceed. 5.5 million people are facing crisis levels of food insecurity, and 350,000 are at catastrophic risk. There are sickening accounts of Tigrayans being held in prison camps near the Sudanese border, with reports from Sudan of corpses floating down the Setit River, clearly identifiable as Tigrayans and showing signs of torture. This conflict contains the hallmarks of ethnic cleansing and genocide. And there are reports of the use of white phosphorus, which, while not classified as a chemical weapon, delivers appalling injuries. In addition to the problems with humanitarian access, it has also been very difficult for journalists seeking to report on the situation in Tigray. There are some extremely brave journalists who have continued to do so, often placing themselves in grave danger and facing an aggressive smear campaign for their work. Among them, I would particularly pay tribute to Nima El-Bagir and Lucy Kassa, brave women who've done so much to bear witness to the atrocities in Tigray. Despite the horrors unfolding in Tigray, this conflict has remained underreported and under-prioritised by the international community. I secured an adjournment debate on Tigray in March, and at that time, 5 months into the conflict, with 10,000 women and girls at that point reported to have been raped, this was the only debate to have taken place in any Western parliament. I have constituents with loved ones in Tigray in fear for their lives, and constituents working with NGOs in Ethiopia seeking to deliver aid to Tigray. The response to the conflict from the UN so far has been insufficiently resourced, and there is an urgent need for additional capacity. In this context, it is also concerning that the government of Ethiopia appears to be withdrawing from the international community, with reports that as many as half, around 30 of its international embassies, are to close. I hope the Minister will set out today what the UK government is doing to secure a stronger response from the UN and ensure that the attention of the international community is focused on Tigray. What is the government doing to increase the mobilisation of UK-funded aid to support UK nationals delivering humanitarian assistance? What is the government doing to secure a peace process to prevent this conflict from escalating further across Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa? Will the UK government prioritise trauma support and healthcare services for women and girls who are survivors of rape and sexual violence as a first-order priority of its humanitarian response? And will the Minister finally recognise the catastrophic implications of cutting international aid at this time? The conflict in Ethiopia risks a humanitarian catastrophe potentially as serious as the famine of the 1980s. And there are other equally pressing priorities across the world, including the 18 million people in need of humanitarian aid in Afghanistan. In the current context of cuts, each time the Minister stands up and says that the government is committing additional resources to a humanitarian emergency, it begs the question, at the expense of which other humanitarian priority is this additional aid being delivered? And this simply cannot be justified in the face of such unfolding horror.
Thank you, Helen. Now over to Florence Ashalomi. Florence, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davis, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship and to be back in Westminster Hall. I almost got lost this morning. I also want to pay tribute to the member for Rotherham for calling this really important and timely debate, and her opening remarks in highlighting the need for us to make sure this does stay on the agenda. With the 24-hour news cycle, it's so easy for major issues of this scale to be pushed down, and the constant refreshing and updating, one could almost forget. So it's really important for us here in this Parliament to keep this on the government's agenda and looking at what clear action and response our government will be leading to help this situation. This situation is nothing short of a humanitarian crisis. The war that erupted last year and the horrific human rights abuse, and with the reports coming just this week of thousands of men, women and children being forced into concentration camps and door-to-door ethnic purging of the Tigrayan people. The International Development Committee also highlighted the gender nature human rights abuse in Tigray, with sexual violence being a key feature of this abuse. Yeah. Last month, the report by Amnesty International revealed that the forces aligned to the Ethiopian government had subjected women and girls to sexual violence, rape and sexual slavery. If we are committed to ending sexual violence against women in this country, we have to be equally committed to helping those women and girls across the country. For those with family in the region, like my constituent who contacted me in March, the war has made contacting their loved ones even so much more difficult. They are worried, they are petrified for their loved ones. And tragically, this isolation has made it so much harder for the humanitarian aid to get through to the people who need it the most. Food has run out in many regions in Tigray. And as the Right Honourable Member for Sutton Coldfield highlighted, over 150 people have died of starvation last month alone. 150 people dying of starvation. That should shame us as a country. And there can be no mistake that the levels of human suffering is a direct result of the conflict, and it shows no sign of a peaceful resolution anytime soon. So as Honourable and Right Honourable Members have asked the Government this morning, I'd like to also ask the Minister, what additional act and support would Government be offering to help address this really serious issue, to help bring an end to the conflict? And will the Government be using its relationship with the Ethiopian authorities to ensure that the Government protects those affected communities and brings an end to this human rights and gender-based violence which we are seeing? Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Fleur Anderson, we look forward to hearing from you. Fleur.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, Mr Davis, and to be back in the real Westminster Hall today. And I do congratulate the Honourable Member for Rotherham for securing this very important and timely debate. And I agree with many members in the debate today that the eyes of the world are not on Tigray as they should be. And so this is an important time to set on the record what's happening there right now, and to hear from the Minister what is our response. I share the distress, sadness displayed by so many colleagues this morning at what we're still witnessing in Tigray. It is a truly heartbreaking situation. At the time of Live Aid, I think we are so proud as a country that we stood up together and we supported the people of Ethiopia in their time of crisis. And we want to do the same again. We want to know what's happening in that region. We feel a great bond, as well as those constituents that I have who have family members in the region. The UN Secretary-General says that as a humanitarian catastrophe is unfolding before our eyes. The Foreign Secretary took his eye off Afghanistan, so I hope to hear from the Minister today that this is not the case for Tigray. I have been heartened that the Foreign Secretary mentioned Tigray in briefings held during the recess, so I'm glad of this opportunity for the Minister to be able to lay out what is happening from the British Government. And I will also have some questions as well. On the 4th of November 2020, armed conflict broke out between the regional government and the federal government in northern Ethiopia in the country's Tigray region. This conflict has since spilled over into neighbouring Amhara and Afar regions. Reports indicate that clashes continue in northern Ethiopia involving Ethiopian, Amhara and Tigrayan forces. Hundreds of thousands of people are displaced in Afar and Amhara, and over 2.2 million people are now thought to be displaced in Tigray and to neighbouring countries, as has been mentioned before in this debate, including many to Sudan. It's estimated that over 6 million people across the areas are affected by the crisis and in need of assistance. The scale of this humanitarian crisis is staggering. More than 5 million people in Tigray require immediate humanitarian assistance, and there are at least 54 organisations providing aid and services. And I join with other members in paying tribute to the brave humanitarian workers on the ground right now. However, there are significant gaps in assistance that are disproportionately affect Ethiopian women and girls, who have virtually no access to livelihoods and often live in insecure environments. The harvests are failing right now. The harvests of November and December are likely to fail. There hasn't been an ability to plant. And so the crisis is getting worse. And that verification on the ground is needed. For months, Ethiopian troops, aided by Eritrean soldiers, have tortured, sexually assaulted, killed and displaced Tigrayan civilians. The TPLF has also perpetrated human rights abuses and the looting of a US aid warehouse. OCHA, the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, reported on the 19th of August that while access in large areas inside Tigray is now feasible and secure, other areas remain inaccessible. The extended delays with clearance of humanitarian supplies, with lorries going in but not coming out again to replenish their stocks, is a major issue right now. And OCHA also say that they are 50% short of the funding needed to respond now. So the questions I would like to ask are, when did the Foreign Secretary last speak to the Ethiopian government and make these points? Has the Prime Minister spoken to his Ethiopian counterpart? What steps are the UK government taking to ensure the protection of civilians, including women and girls, from sexual and gender-based violence in particular? Will the Minister ensure that aid is prioritised for this crisis and do all in his power to press the Ethiopian government for an increase in funding, for the cessation of fighting, for unfettered humanitarian access through the road through Amhara region, for example, is now closed? What's happening with that? The resumption of essential services, water and sanitation, power, banking and communications. To challenge the Ethiopian government on the rhetoric being used against the humanitarian community, which is endangering aid workers, many of them British aid workers, right now in the region, and ceasing the targeting and arresting of Tigrayans in Addis Ababa. The eyes of the world must be on Tigray, and urgent action must be taken. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Fleur. And last but not least from the backbenchers, the indefatigable Jim Shannon. Jim.
It's an absolute pleasure to be back in as the Honourable Lady referred to, the real Westminster Hall and to be part of those debates. Can I thank the Honourable Lady for Rotherham for, first of all, setting the scene? We've all said it, but we all mean it. Mr Davies, she's certainly a champion on these issues. She speaks out, and whenever there's a debate and I see her name on that debate, I'm right away attracted to come and speak in that matter, because it's a matter that I share with her and my concerns. And the concerns have been expressed by everyone here today, so I'm really pleased to say that. It seems at times like this that all eyes are on Afghanistan, and that's perhaps as it should be, because it's understandable. However, this debate today reminds us that throughout the world there are people in need of the help and support, and the war in Tigray area of Ethiopia is one such place. The Honourable Gentleman referred to the historical connections and relationships that the United Kingdom have with Ethiopia. We should be able to use those and use our influence, and I'm hoping maybe the Minister can tell us what can be done to do that. I also declare an interest as I chair the APPG in freedom of religious belief. Since the war in Ethiopia, Tigray region began last November, over 52,000 people have died, an estimated 1.7 million have been displaced. Persecution.org puts a summary like this. On March the 10th, 2021, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken testified before the US Congress about the ethnic cleansing occurring in Ethiopia, particularly in the Tigray region. In early November, Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed announced military operations against the region's ruling party, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which he accused of attacking a federal army base. Despite denial of that, of course, the Eritrean military, as well as forces from the adjoining region, Amhara, have been participating in the offensive and have been committing war crimes. They've been illustrated by other members. I don't tend to repeat them. They're horrific to listen to, and they grieve me greatly, Mr Chairman, when I listen to them. According to witness reports, human rights abuses such as rapes, mass killings being perpetrated by the various actors involved in the conflict. And as is so often the case, Christians are often caught in the crossfire as ethnic and political conflict accelerates. This year, Ethiopia rose from 39th to 36th in the Open Doors World Watch list of countries with the worst persecution. The change was due to an increase in violence against Christians. In addition, there are reports that Christians were discriminated against in the distribution of government aid during the COVID-19 pandemic. International Christian Concern reported September 20 that 500 Christians have been killed since June of last year. And in late November 2020, just last year, Approximately 800 people were killed near St Mary of Zion Church in the northern Tigray region. The situation is dire for Christians and indeed people of all faith and those of no faith. There's no one really safe in the Tigray region, and that's a fact. The debate highlights the need for the FCDO to offer more help to address the reality of living life in war-torn Tigray, with children living in fear, with no education or vocational prospects, insufficient food, and with family units decimated. How important it is to have families, and families are dispersed and attacked and violated. Less than 10% of the required humanitarian cargo, 2.2% of the necessary operational cost, 28% of fuel have been able to reach Tigray since the 12th of July. Only 300,000 hectares of farmland were planted out of 1.3 million hectares available, with a maximum of 13% of agricultural yields expected, further exacerbating the food insecurity. So much needs to be done. I know that we in the UK can always play our part, but we need confirmation from the Minister that that's happening in every way. Only 25% to 50% of the normal cereal production will be available this year, as agricultural planting season has been missed in many parts of Tigray. Due to food stock depletion, only 131,000 people were assisted with food between 19th and 25th of August, and it was 547,000 in a similar period a week earlier. An estimated 1.7 million people are facing food insecurity in Afar and Amhara regions due to the spillover of the Tigray conflict. I understand the Minister will outline the steps that this government has taken, and I welcome those steps. However, my question is simple. Can we do more? The answer is, from everyone here, is yes, we can. Can we offer more support? Can we uplift the aid? Can we use local churches and NGOs to ensure that the aid gets through to those who need it most? Minister, I ask you my question. Can those churches, can those NGOs be used? And please, if possible, either today or in the future, tell us what can be done. Will we stand by and watch, or will we be able to say that we did what we could? I conclude with this, Mr Davies. I implore the SCDO and the Minister to review this scenario, source additional support to feed these children and help these people to plant the crops and to ensure that there is at least some hope of a future for these people, which we all ask for today in this hall. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. And then over to Alan Smith. If you keep your remarks to about 10 minutes, that'd be helpful. Thank you, Alan.
Mr Davies, I've always struck me that nobody ever criticised a speech for being too short, so I always endeavour to keep my remarks brief. It's a genuine pleasure to wind up this debate and follow so many consensual speeches, and I'd also congratulate the Chair of the International Development Committee for bringing this really very important issue up the agenda, because we can't lose sight of the tragedy that is unfolding. The first casualty of war is truth, and that's certainly the case in Tigray. There has been wrongdoing on all sides, and it is difficult to calculate what's actually happening on the ground. So there's been some very strong contributions throughout this debate. I was particularly struck by my friend from Glasgow North, who gave us the context that this is a reversal of the progress that had been made. It didn't need to be like this. There has been good, constructive aid spent. There has been progress made. And what we are now seeing is a tragedy where we're genuinely witnessing sexual violence and starvation being used as weapons of war. And this is while the world is watching. And the scale, as we've heard, is quite staggering. 900,000 Tigrayans are starving. 5 million are on the brink of starvation and experiencing chronic food insecurity. An estimated 15,000 cases of rape in the last 7 months has been calculated by Amnesty International, with 2.2 million displaced persons so far, with many more in grave danger. Now, this has been a very consensual debate, and I'm glad to hear it, because this is not for party political knockabout. But where we do very strongly diverge from the UK government from the SNP perspective is our deep sadness at the walking away from the 0.7 aid commitment. We can't do more with less. And we see that in Tigray, we see it elsewhere, and it is a reversal of the UK's good work on international development, as we've heard, which we regret deeply, and particularly with so many former DFID personnel being based in Scotland and East Kilbride. We feel that very personally, and we would again urge the UK government to reverse course on these cuts. A number of concrete questions to the Minister. As I said, I always seek to be brief. What discussions and what success has the UK government had in its talks with Ethiopian and Eritrean governments towards a ceasefire, but also towards achieving humanitarian access? What aid will the UK commit to emergency food aid, particularly as winter is approaching? So many people are at the risk, really grave risk of starvation, and we could see a globally significant tragedy. What assessment has the FCDO made of risk of the instability in Tigray spreading to other regions within Ethiopia, but also to other countries within the wider region? Because this could be at the focal point of a far, far wider crisis, even than it is. The UK has authorised £65,000 worth of military exports to Tigray, to Ethiopia since 2018. Now, that's not huge, but it's surely not appropriate. Can the Minister assure us that there will be no further arms exports to the region? Because that's surely the last thing that the region is needing. And on accountability, there have been war crimes committed within this conflict. What discussions has the UK been part of within the UN in particular, I suspect, to ensure accountability of war criminals within the region? And because we must hold them to account. It's because there are many things that Tigray is going to need support on going forward, and where the UK government makes steps towards those meaningful contributions, they'll continue to have SNP support, because this is too important for party political knockabout. Thank you, Mr Davis.
To invite Stephen Doughty.
Well, thank you, Chair. It's a pleasure to serve your chairmanship, Mr Davis. And I want to thank, in particular, my honourable friend from Rotherham, Chair of the Committee, for securing this debate today and for the work that she and her committee have done on this matter, and all who've contributed today, particularly my honourable friends from Vauxhall, Putney, Dulwich and West Norwood, Sheffield, Stockport and more. But also want to thank all the other members, because I think what's been clear today is the level of concern here, and the comments that were made by the honourable members from Tewkesbury, from Congleton, the honourable member from Sutton Coldfield, from Glasgow, from Strangford. All of them have illustrated some of the horrific reports that we're getting from Tigray and the wider concerns of this House. And as the honourable member from the SNP just said, this is not about party political issues. This is about concern for the people of Ethiopia, of Tigray, and our wider humanitarian and human rights responsibilities in this world. And that's why it's an issue as well, Ms Davis, that I and the Labour Front bench have repeatedly raised with ministers, and we've had many discussions with the Minister over this, and also with the Ethiopian government and other parties directly. And I want to commend all those humanitarian and human rights agencies who are doing remarkable work on the ground. And as has also been mentioned, the journalists who are reporting in very difficult circumstances, but that reporting is so crucial for us understanding what is going on in situations like this, and attempts to intimidate and threaten them have been deeply disturbing to me. And I've been absolutely horrified by some of the allegations of abuses on all sides, the reports of ethnic cleansing, of religious persecution, of attacks on women and on children, allegations of torture, allegations of war crimes. Some of the stuff is just simply horrific. And as ever in these situations, it is civilians who suffer. And the tragedy is that we are yet to see full human rights investigations and actions on those who perpetrated these crimes. We have yet to see full humanitarian access. And quite frankly, we've yet to see a sense of humanity breaking through the fog and the horrors of this war. And I share the concerns expressed by many members about this becoming a forgotten crisis. We've all been deeply concerned about what's going on in Afghanistan, but we must recognise that there are crises and tragedies happening in so many other places in the world, whether it's Yemen, whether it's across the Sahel, whether it's Ethiopia. We've seen the recent disturbing events in Guinea in recent days. And we as a House and the Government, I hope, are keeping a full awareness of all of these situations and taking action wherever appropriate. But I wanted to start with on some of the comments that have been made. The Honourable Member for Dulwich and West Norwood spoke in the adjournment debate very powerfully earlier this year about the sexual violence that we've seen, and I will come on to this, but this shocking figure that an estimated 10,000 rapes had happened is simply horrific, and all sides, as I said, have been accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The Secretary-General described the situation in Tigray as hellish, and I think that very much bears out what we've heard today. Thousands have already died. 4.4 million people are now in IPC phase 3 or above, with 1.7 million facing food insecurity in the Afar and Amhara regions as well. 400,000 people in famine-like conditions, and we all remember that tragedy of the early 1980s and the consequences again of human-made conflict and the consequences of that for civilians, leading into absolutely devastating famine. But I think it's very important that we focus on the experiences of ordinary people living in Tigray, especially women and girls who are facing the consequences of this conflict. And the Amnesty International report on sexual violence was particularly damning about the sadistic brutality that is being inflicted on women by people on all sides of this conflict. Rape and sexual violence being used systematically to torture and dehumanise women, and in some cases children, women being kept as sex slaves, subjected to genital mutilation, and acts often being horrifically conducted in front of other family members to impose further psychological damage. And of course women and girls are at risk even if they survive these attacks, because only 53% of health facilities have clinical capacity for management of rape and sexual violence, and only 1 in 10 of health facilities overall are functioning, many of which are also in the control, or at least access to them controlled by some of those who've been committing crimes. And I'll read one particular extract from the Amnesty report. A man, the father of a 10-year-old child who was raped. I'm not going to go into the details of this because it's simply too horrific to read out. In November 2020, told Amnesty that he was not able to get his daughter, who had suffered such terrible physical and psychological damage, to the hospital for 4.5 months. He said he wanted to take her to the hospital in one location, but it was the armed forces that committed the abuses who were administering it, so had to then seek support at another location, where she did in the end receive medical help, but only after months and months of trauma, and that is utterly horrific. And these women often have no way to receive help for the consequences of these actions. Of course, the area is also experiencing wider famine conditions, the impact of the locusts, the impacts of climate change, of course the impacts of COVID, the impacts of other disease as well. And I think it's worth recognising that the pressures of this current conflict come on top of all of those other issues, because this is already an area that significant challenges. That wider humanitarian situation, 5.2 million out of 6 million people living in Tigray are now in need of humanitarian assistance, and 13.6 million people are estimated to be food insecure across Ethiopia as a result of the conflict, but also those wider circumstances. Only 25% to 50% of normal cereal production is available this year, according to OCHA. And of course, the situation facing people who've been internally displaced and refugees, I'll come on to ask some questions about this, but there are now 2 million internally displaced people, according to USAID, with nearly 50,000 refugees arriving in South Sudan as a result since November 2021. And of course, there's a spillover of IDPs into the Afar and Amhara regions as well. We've heard from many members today about the challenges of getting humanitarian assistance in. One of the reports from OCHA said that only 10% of the 3,500 cargo trucks carrying life-saving materials had actually been able to enter the region. And the USAID chief, Samantha Power, was very clear. She said the shortage is not because food is unavailable, but because the government is obstructing humanitarian aid and personnel, including land convoys and air access. And I would be interested in the UK government's comments on her remarks. There are also reports that ENDF soldiers forcibly entered the WFP and UNICEF offices and destroyed communications equipment belonging to those two agencies. So I would be interested to know what the Minister has to say about those recent events and what his view is as who is responsible for those. I mentioned the situation of refugees. I'm particularly concerned for the 24,000 Eritrean refugees, remembering, of course, there are many refugees in the region already because of the previous conflicts in Mayagni and Adi Harush camps in the northwestern zone who've been cut off from assistance and apparently not reached since mid-July. It's been reported both those camps have run out of food and the refugees are facing violence and intimidation by armed groups. So what assessment has been made of the situation of refugees and IDPs, the numbers, the needs, and of these attacks? And particularly, there were disturbing reports of people being forcibly relocated from refugee camps earlier in this crisis. What has happened to them? What is the assessment that has been made? And what has been the involvement of Eritrean or other irregular forces in attacks in that region? Even in the last couple of days, we've seen some pretty horrendous information coming out from the UN. They're talking about the Samara-Abala corridor, which has been inaccessible since the 22nd of August, that 200,000 litres of fuel is required for the humanitarian response, that is not available as well, the needs of cash as well to pay for services locally, which again has not come in the levels needed to provide services. UNICEF reporting that 100,000 face severe acute malnutrition in the year. And the humanitarian acting coordinator in Tigray, Grant Laity said that all parties to conflict must allow and facilitate the rapid and unimpeded passage of impartial humanitarian relief to avoid a catastrophe. And he is very, very stark in what he says about the risks of famine and significant levels of mortality. We've heard the reports, it was mentioned by other colleagues, about 150 people allegedly having died of starvation directly. Obviously, that report is from the TPLF. It's not able to be independently verified, but certainly it tallies with the figures that we've heard from the UN and other agencies who've spoken of 400,000 already living in famine-like conditions. I want to end by asking the Minister some very specific questions. Yesterday, the WFP announced that it faces a funding gap of $426 million for its operations across Ethiopia to meet the needs of 12 million people in 2021. The US increased its funding to the WFP by $149 million in June, and I wonder what the UK is going to be doing specifically to support some of those agencies like the WFP. We also heard about women's programmes that had been cut. We've been very, very clear. We think that the decision to cut the commitment from 0.7 to 0.5% was completely wrong, and I think exemplified in situations like this. And I know the Minister doesn't want to answer this question directly, but I'm going to ask him again. Is our total support to Ethiopia going up this year, or is it going down? Because I know he's spoken about 42.7 million plus 5 million for refugees in Sudan being given. That's obviously welcome. It's obviously welcome with that focus on Tigray. But obviously, if the total support for Ethiopia is going down, that money's being diverted from other needs, and of course there are many needs elsewhere in Ethiopia as well, that is deeply concerning. And I do worry that we're going to find ourselves very much in the situation we've seen over Afghanistan, where we see cuts and then having to simply reverse those. We need to be putting that resource in because the needs are so great. The access issues I've mentioned, but I wondered if the government has specifically raised the access issues around the roads and the access for fuel trucks and food trucks in recent days, because there do seem to have been some particular problems in the last few weeks. The Security Council report mentions that Turkey and Sudan had been acting as attempting to act as mediators. That we know other regional powers have also been attempting to act as mediators in the conflict. What's the Minister's assessment of those regional and international efforts? Is the UK offering any particular diplomatic and good offices support there to attempts to reach a peaceful settlement between the parties? I understand the Foreign Secretary spoke in early August to Prime Minister Abiy. Have there been further contact with Prime Minister Abiy and Ethiopian ministers and other parties to the conflict since that point? It's welcome that he did that. I'm sure the Minister himself has been in contact with people, but it'd be useful to understand who and when. Have we identified anybody yet for Magnitsky-style sanctions? The US Department of the Treasury imposed sanctions on the Chief of Staff of the Eritrean Defence Forces for alleged crimes in Ethiopia. Have we got any sanctions that have been issued? I know he won't speak about ones that are potentially coming, but have we issued any? What role have we been playing at the Human Rights Council? What discussions have we had with the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights? I finished, Mr. Davis, by saying, we've got a huge responsibility, and we have a particular relationship with Ethiopia. We have a particular friendship, we have a particular history in terms of our aid programme. The world has a responsibility to protect civilians in crises like this. There is a keen interest from this House, from the British public in the situation in Ethiopia. We all want to see a prosperous, secure and inclusive Ethiopia, but that sadly seems very far from the situation at present.
Thanks so much. I'm pleased to say the Minister's got about 15 minutes, if he allows 2 minutes for the Chair to respond. So with luck, there might even be time for a couple of interventions. Over to you, Minister. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mr. Davis, and thank you for providing plenty of time. I know there's lots of interest in the House across this issue, and it's quite right that we review. And this is a great opportunity both to update the House as to what is happening, but also to directly answer the questions, and I'm more than happy to take interventions throughout. The conflict in northern Ethiopia has now entered its 11th month. It is a horrific conflict, and to make matters worse, in reply principally to the member for Sutton Coldfield, but others, I am concerned about it spreading, not only within the region, but also across the rest of Ethiopia. I will go through some more detail of contact and activity, but this is something very much at the forefront of what's happening in the Foreign Office. I was in a meeting last week with the Foreign Secretary reviewing all of this, as the member for Cardiff South and Penarth As mentioned, Foreign Secretary spoke to Prime Minister Abiy last month, and there is literally not a day goes by that I do not engage in this issue, either directly or through other intermediaries, whether that be other countries, other regional players, other organisations, because this isn't just a concern of the United Kingdom, it's a concern across the continent and through other international bodies. And can I also just address the issue of money? I know there's a debate about 0.5 and 0.7, but I think the Honourable Member for Cardiff South nailed it when referencing Samantha Power in that the real issue is not about money and resource in Ethiopia. It's about getting access. And I'll go through some of the detail and some of the numbers on that access. And the next stage will be around moving from conflict to mediation. And then there will be, I'm sure, resourcing issues where the points that are being made now will perhaps be more relevant. But I won't focus on the broader debate, and hopefully honourable members will recognise that there's a more immediate problem of access. So getting into some of the detail and updating the House on what's been happening, the TPLF, Tigray People's Liberation Front, continue military action, and that's going beyond Tigray into the Amhara and Afar regions. This is suffering, extending the remit of the suffering and the nature of the suffering. And we have consistently called on all sides to stop the fighting. It is horrific to have to listen to the stories of what is happening, but it is clear rape and sexual violence are being used as a weapon of war. Famine is being used as a weapon of war. There was reference to chemical weapons. It is difficult to establish definitively what is being used, but what is clear is civilian populations are being targeted, which in itself is against international humanitarian law. So, if your child or your mother or your family die, it may be technically relevant how they die, but if they're being targeted, that is the offensive thing that we need to stop happening. Humanitarian agencies are realistically facing what I would describe as a de facto blockade of aid into Tigray, and to avert further humanitarian catastrophe over and beyond the atrocities which we've already seen, we call on the Ethiopian government to allow unfettered access and to start restoring essential services, and I'll go into a bit more detail in a second. Eritrean forces, alas, are once again in Ethiopian sovereign territory in significant numbers, and they must withdraw, and their failure to withdraw again will lead to a further escalation in this conflict, which simply is not needed. The position that both parties are taking is not helpful. I've been asked about mediation. There's a number of mediation attempts. There's a lot of discussion. I'm not going to go into detail of some of that mediation, but it is fair to say it is not currently working. So different things need to be tried in different ways. I mean, since November, more than 2 million people have been displaced across Tigray, and 450,000 just in Afar and Amhara in the more recent conflicts. Basically, everything's broken down. 90% of hospitals are working. 90% of hospitals and health centres aren't working. There's no banking facilities, no electricity. Communications are down, which leads it makes it very difficult to verify some of the stories as well. So if things did open out, which we would encourage, no doubt we will find out more, and it will feel worse. I certainly will give way.
Just on the issue of communications, again, I highlighted that I have constituents who are very worried about their family members. If you're saying that communication is broken down, is there anything more that the government could help in terms of with members who are trying to get that crucial information for their constituents?
I think there are things at the periphery that can be done, but at the heart is about building that access in the fullest sense of the words. I mean, early on in the conflict, we were even finding evidence of satellite phones from aid organisations being taken and used for other purposes, further breaking down. And there are some parties that don't want open access to communications. They want to finish the conflict as they see it on both sides. In terms of the supplies getting through, there's a need for over 100 trucks every single day to get in. That is a massive logistic effort, even if everybody was behind that effort. Since the 12th of July, only about 10% of the required aid is able to get through. So UN warehouses in Tigray aren't being restocked. They are empty. Over a third, most people aren't eating effectively or aren't eating enough. There is no private sector provision. So even if one has money, there is nothing to buy. Displaced individuals, I'll finish this point and then I'll give way. Displaced individuals are relying on host communities who are already suffering, but this lack of goods meant that prices have gone up five-fold, and community resilience is eroding to the point of tipping over to an even more serious and systemic problem.
Sir Champion.
Thank you, Chair. The director of Oxfam in Ethiopia yesterday was raising the fact that because the internet is deliberately down, it was almost impossible to get money transfers, which is deeply hampering their process. I wonder if I could echo his plea, if the Minister could try and get at least a window of the internet being up so that money transfers could occur.
I'll investigate the specific issue of internationals working together to make sure that money comes through. I'm certainly in touch with a number of ministers, Ethiopian ministers, including the finance minister, and I can raise that issue with him, because that's a slightly separate problem to the one that we're discussing. I give way to the Honourable Member for Strangford and then the Honourable Member for Cardiff, and then I'll make some progress.
Response, Minister. In my contribution, I referred to some churches and NGOs who are active in the Tigray region. If we have groups like that who are there, are operating there, is it not possible that we could coordinate our relief efforts alongside those people and those groups to ensure that when it comes to getting to the people who need it, that we can work in partnership? It's just a thought. I think it would be important that we use all avenues that we can. Thank you.
It's a good thought. It's something we will do. It's something we are doing, and certainly I will discuss with our envoy for freedom of religion and belief to make it as effective as possible. But these networks are really useful networks to validate informally before we see on the ground what's happening.
It's about communications, and the Minister will be aware that our own CBC and indeed Vodafone from the UK have invested substantial amounts in the new Ethiopia Telecommunications Partnership. Now, obviously, opening up telecommunications to people across Ethiopia is a good thing. That's good for all the people. But obviously, given some of the issues we've heard here about money transfers, about internet access, about telecommunications being cut off, is there not some sort of incongruity between those two things? What are we going to be doing through those types of investments to ensure that we get telecommunications open in Tigray properly?
Well, various members have talked to the size of the population, 120 million. The Honourable Member Tewkesbury, as the able chair of the All-Party Group, has talked to this nation of optimism. This is one of the gems at the heart of our East African strategy, a bastion of stability if we could build out from, not be resolving problems. And telecommunications is an essential good. It allows people to trade, it allows for cash transfers. So this is the right investment thinking forward. It's a long-term investment. It's something we've been talking about for years and years, and will be deliverable going forward. But it does seem incongruent talking of Ethiopia as a place of optimism and an investment. But we simply have to get back to that place when we get beyond this, because that is where development happens. There's talk of echoes of the 80s and Live Aid, and we did a brilliant job. And Ethiopia has done a brilliant job in bringing itself up. And when there has been a natural crisis, yes, they've needed help, but they've also been able to help themselves. And we need to reset to get back to that position. But, we're just so far away from that point at the moment. I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you very much. He's quite right about the massive British taxpayer investment and the huge results that have been achieved. Can I just ask him whether he will, following my earlier comments, give the committee an undertaking that he will look personally at the funding for the World Food Programme, who are absolutely at the critical edge of all this humanitarian crisis? Will you have a look at their funding this year and see what more can be done to meet the need there?
I will. I'm already in communications with David Beasley in general. I've discussed the situation in Ethiopia with him, both in terms of food provision, but also he is an influential figure in the region. But today, my initial issue is getting access. It's not getting food. And until we sort that, no amount of money, no amount of WFP extra resource is going to do it. But there will be a point at which we need to do that, and we need to be ready. So I pledge to have another discussion with David Beasley to take these issues forward. I'm concerned to hear reports of press, NGOs, civil society, churches and so forth being targeted, but we'll confirm that is happening. People are being arrested based on their ethnicity, and clearly there needs to be a stringent following of international rules and human rights. And would like to reassure the House that we are engaged fully at all levels, both locally within those groups, but also at the United Nations through Lord Ahmed. Nick Dyer's also been to Ethiopia twice since November, the envoy on famine prevention, including getting access to Tigray. British Embassy staff have visited on multiple occasions. I spoke only yesterday with our Chargé, a new development director, to get updates, and that is a very normal thing, although I would have done that in preparation for this debate. As I say, there's not a day goes by that I'm not doing something on this, but that's not to say we're doing enough, but it gives you an idea. It's good that President Obasanjo has been appointed on the 26th of August to look at issues around the Horn. Yet again, this is another way of pushing mediation of various descriptions. We're doing a lot through the G7, through all counterparties discussions. We are still, even notwithstanding the fact that money and food immediately is not the issue, we're still the second largest donor to Ethiopia on sexual violence. There's some good news. The Honourable Member for Totnes, who's not currently in this place, led a debate on this following his intervention, and at the Select Committee we're now deploying 2 individuals based on the scoping mission into Mekelle. I will give way very briefly.
I thank the Minister. Very short question. You're referring to high-level conversations. Has the Prime Minister spoken to Prime Minister Abiy?
The answer is I don't know, so I don't want to say yes or no and mislead. But this is, very much something that is on his desk. What I haven't got is a kind of TikTok of his interactions. So the situation is dire, it is horrific, but there is a nation we can get back to and a relationship we can get back to that is a positive one. We have a long-standing and deep friendship with the people of Ethiopia. Our development partnership has made a major contribution to lifting people out of poverty, to political reform, to economic reform, and had increased prosperity in that country. So I talk today about the horrific incidents with great sadness, but we should aim to get back to where we were and progress with that nation and put it back on a more positive path. I thank the House for raising this debate.
Thank you, Minister. And Sarah Champion to wind up. Sarah.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, can I thank every member that has spoken today, both for the tone and the content, and also to the Minister, who I know is deeply committed to this area. The problem is this isn't going to go away, and it's important for all of us to keep it on the agenda, both of the Minister but also of the international community. The risks that we have highlighted are dire, and I can't see a way easily that they're going to be resolved without international intervention, to get all of the parties round the table and actually discuss a long-term solution. And the threats to the broader region are also profound. I'd like to raise one thing with the Minister, which has been raised in the debate, and that is about atrocity prevention. It was the one thing in my committee's report that the government pushed back on, and so I'd like to request a meeting with the Minister to discuss just that.
I agree. I note the work that's been done on that. There's still more work to be done, a more nuanced solution. I agree to arrange a meeting with officials to work out a better way forward following the report.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. The question is that this House has considered the humanitarian situation in Tigray. As many as of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.